Hey, welcome again to the podcast. I can say that now because this is the second episode. Super glad you could join me. My house right now is a balmy 50 degrees. I have a space heater in here that is currently turned off, so who knows how long I can record before I'll freeze. My boiler went out and I'm having people replace it. It's the weekend, so they're not here doing it, but hopefully they can get it finished up on Monday so I can move back home and out of my parents' house. Because me, my wife, my 3 kids, and 2 dogs moved in with my parents who have been empty nesters for, 10 years. So that's been a lot of fun to deal with this week. There were a lot of bugs at work this week. It was just one of those weeks, Everything went crazy. And there were so many random problems. But it's good. That means next week is going to be fine. Also this week, there was a bunch of news that I'm going to talk about. There's some conference announcements. There are security issues that came out that you need to be aware of and upgrade if they affect you. There's just some random cool articles and libraries that I found. I'm also going to dedicate a chunk of time at the end to talk about monoliths versus microservices. There were a couple things that came out this week related to that I wanted to go over. I'm really interested in the topic. I think it's a great debate. So look forward to that at the end. But first, before I talk about anything else, I need to talk about TIS 100. I got a chance to play it this weekend. Like I said last week, I would. Man, it's fun. It's a game where you kind of have to figure out this assembly language and fix these bugs. You go through these sequence of programs that you have to write that are essentially puzzles. But you get to unlock things if you do it in a certain amount of cycles, and if you don't use certain statements, you get more points essentially. It's really cool. I recommend it. We can compare scores. Check out the show notes for more details. Again, it's TIS 100. It's on Steam. When I bought it, it was $6.99. So really small investment for hours of fun. Check it out. Moving on to conferences this week. We'll kick it off with Music City Code 2006. This is a conference that's happening in Nashville in August 18th to 20th. Their call for speakers open March 1st. If you go to cfp.musiccitycode.com, you can see more about it. And from their site, it's a 3-day event touching all aspects of software, web, and mobile development. The event includes workshops, seminars, panel discussions, open spaces, lightning talks, and the Geek Jam Lunch, where attendees participate in the Music City Code experience. I don't know what the Music City Code experience is, but it sounds like fun. I know some people who are involved in the actual thing. Nashville has a soft spot for me because it's where I used to live. I lived there for, 9 or 10 years. And if you spend the better part of a decade somewhere, you grow a bit attached. But their call for papers is open now. Check it out. I'm going to put in for that conference. I don't know what I'm going to talk about. There's a few conferences that I got to do proposals for. This is going to be one of them because I just want to get back to Nashville. I haven't been there in over a year. Got a lot of friends down there. Hope to run into some people there. Maybe take a few extra days off. Yeah, like last week I said I want to put in for the Elixir Conf. So maybe I can use the same talk for all this stuff. Just keep giving it all around. No one needs to know. Nobody goes to all the conferences, so it should work. Okay, second conference is the Empire City Elixir Conference 2016. It's a 1-day conference. It's Saturday, May 21st in New York City. The call for speakers is open on that until Tuesday, March 15th. And they're going to have all their selections done by Friday, April 1st. So submit your talk to that. Obviously, Elixir focused. Keep it fun. Let me see where it's going to be. It's actually going to be... I have no idea where that is. There's a guy I work with, Will Raxworthy, who's putting in for the conference. He's got a cool talk lined up. I won't give too much away, though, or anything away for that matter, because it's his talk to give, not mine. So tickets for that one are actually pretty good. They've got the early bird, looks like it's all sold out now, but they have the standard pricing, which is $200, and then the pricing goes up, closer to the event. But if you go on there now, buy your tickets, $200. If you're in the New York City area or you want an excuse to go to New York City May 21st, check out the Empire City Elixir Conference. Their website is empex.co, empex.co. And the last conference I want to talk about is a 1-day single track, essentially a Ruby conference in New York City. They do other stuff, but it's primarily for the Ruby community, it seems like. But that's Saturday, June 25th, and their call for papers is also open. I don't know when it closes, but their website is GoRuco.com, GORUCO.com. If you go to their website, you can find past videos. You can see the types of things that they're looking for there. Last year, I'm looking at it now, topics included building and testing resilient applications, home automation with the Amazon Echo and Ruby, Great caching disasters. I like that one. Unartificial intelligence, Rails 5, TurboLinks 3, event sourcing, and even sweaters as a service. It looks like they're specifically looking for talks on Go, Elixir, DevOps, Docker, and they say whatever else is exciting you as a maker lately. So they definitely seem to be, you see sweaters as a service last year, mentioning Elixir and Golang, and saying maker makes you think that they probably want to focus. If you have something that you want to talk about IoT-based or distributed systems of some kind, this is probably a conference to get it at. The conference talks that they're actually looking for are pretty short. The full-length talks are 30 minutes, but they also have 10-minute micro talks. So pretty much no matter what you want to do, they're going to be able to kind of accommodate the talk. I really like the little 10-minute micro talk idea. It's kind of nice if you have an idea that you've been kind of kicking around but don't have a full-fledged talk yet, but kind of want to do intro to this. Or if you're working on some new library, those are the good talks to have it at. So that's it for conferences. So a couple more random pieces of news. The Raspberry Pi 3 is on sale now for $35. I have a Raspberry Pi. I should have more. I don't know why. Right now I use it as like a ZNC server. What else do I use it for? I use it for a handful of stuff. It's fun to play with though. There's actually some irrigation stuff that I want to do this year, so Raspberry Pi might help me out with that. The big difference between this one and the last one, the 2, is this one is a 1.2 gigahertz 64-bit quad-core ARM Cortex A53 CPU. I don't know specifically what that processor is, but it's 10 times faster than the Raspberry Pi 1. So what else can you ask for? 10 times the performance and still $35. So even more importantly, I think, for anybody who uses this kind of technology, this one's got built-in 802.11 and Wi-Fi card, which is awesome, and Bluetooth enabled. So they come with it. And it's completely compatible with the Raspberry Pi 1 and 2. So if you're thinking about making something that relies on a Raspberry Pi, be sure to check out the Raspberry Pi 3. Look at it at raspberrypi.org. And Google hit a bus. So that happened. It sounds like it was only going like 2 miles an hour, but apparently this is the first time Google has copped to "it was our fault." It sounds like there was something on the side of the road and the car swerved very slowly, anticipating that the bus would have slowed down, but the bus did not slow down and the car hit it. It looks like it was just a fender bender, not a big deal. Nobody seems to be freaking out about it on the news, which is great, because I was just expecting, to turn on the news in the morning and see, oh my God, Google crashed into a car. We should no longer do self-driving cars. This is terrible. We're all going to die. But that didn't happen. So everybody stayed calm. Apparently, the human driver in the car too they were analyzing it afterwards. I guess he made the same judgment call that the bus was going to slow down. So yeah, I mean, I've gotten into a handful of car accidents in my life. You can't really blame the car too bad for this one, as it seems like it wasn't too bad. In terms of programming language and framework updates, Rails 4.2.5.2 and 4.1.14.2 and 3.2.22.2 all came out this week. They are security patches. There are two CVE 2016-2097 and CVE 2016-2098. So both of those issues are possible for you if in your controller you try to render unsanitized params. If you're not whitelisting it for whatever reason and you're just doing like render params ID, there's two things that could happen. There's the directory traversal and information leak vulnerability, but there's also a possibility of remote code execution. So you need to update as soon as possible if you are using an older version of Rails, because both of those are terrible, terrible things to have happen. Upgrade as soon as possible. And if for some reason you can't, a workaround would just be to kind of whitelist your incoming parameters before you render. And that's always a good thing anyways. Don't use user input directly. Try to sanitize and whitelist whatever you can, or you're asking for these types of issues to hurt you. Also, Rust 1.7 came out this week. I'm not sure which day. I think it was March 3rd it came out. So they really focused on features this time. I don't use a ton of Rust, to be totally frank, but I really like the language. I've been interested in it. I don't know. I think the past 6 months or so is kind of when it hit my radar, and I'm like, oh, there's some really nice ideas in there. So they're now listing 40 more library functions and methods as stable, which means they're less likely to change that now going forward. If you don't know, Rust is very quick to deprecate things, it sounds like. But yeah, hash map was apparently one of the big things that they changed. They used to make a decision for you that was a trade-off between performance and allowing DOS attacks. By default, performance would get hit to disallow the DOS attack. Now they've made it essentially optional. So you can opt into that performance hit. And apparently you get a significant speed up at the loss of DOS protection. But if that's fine, if you're not taking in input from, again, a user or something like that, you can be pretty safe to use the new, faster version. There's a bunch of other stuff. I'm not a huge Rust guy, so I'm not sure how important some of this stuff is. But if you are interested in Rust, go to rustlang.org, rust-lang.org. You can check out the full release. And I encourage you to look at Rust in general. It's a really cool language if you haven't gone in there yet. Like I said, some really cool ideas, a nice way to do things. So end of last week, too, I meant to bring it up last week, but didn't make it to the show. Ruby 2.0 and Ruby 2.1 are dead. So specifically Ruby 2.0, if you're still using it, please stop using it. There will be no more bug and security fixes for that version of Ruby. There will be no more versions as of February 24th. So upgrade. It's worth it. Make time in your schedule to get it done. Stop waiting. So Ruby 2.1.9 is going to be released at the end of March. And then after that, they're not going to backport any more bug fixes to 2.1 except for security fixes. And after that, they're going to go to the 2.0 route and not do any upgrades ever again on it. So you need to get on, upgrade into 2.2, or even better, 2.3 if you can. Yeah, like I said, schedule it, get it done. Beyond that news, there were a couple things I saw this week that were neat. One was the Valve Employee Handbook. Really cool. I love what they did with it. They made it fun. I've never seen an employee handbook that was actually fun before, but this one was cool. And they talk about settling in and, what to do in your first month, team hours, structures, risks, like what if I screw up? But what if we all screw up? Those kind of things. They also talk about peer performance and reviews, but it's just fun. There's a lot of animations. It almost seems like a manual for a game. They talk about valuations. They talk about T-shaped development. They talk about how Valve is very choose your own adventure type of thing for the first 6 months. They even have a neat animation on how to move your desk, which I definitely haven't seen before. I will post it in the show notes because you should really look at it. I really like this. I want to see if I can get something similar to this going at Alpha Sites, which is the company I work for. I already mentioned it to a couple people, but it's a cool handbook, and I really recommend you check it out. Another thing that they have in it is kind of like a glossary of terms. I know almost every company that I've ever worked at usually has some kind of internal language to describe, bits of software or patterns through the name of different meeting rooms. So I think it'd be really helpful, especially if you're onboarding a lot of people. It just makes it way easier to have something like this and do it fun, and then it's not so stupid. In the world of Elixir, I saw a neat library come out this week. So if you're familiar with Netflix's Chaos Monkey, what it is, it's a service that essentially goes around just sniping EC2 instances and shutting services down for them. They do it so that they ensure a more fault-tolerant system and that they can handle outages. So this library is called Chaos Spawn, and it's essentially the same thing, but it's a low-level process equivalent for Elixir. So what it'll do is it'll go around just shutting down your processes. If you're in a production application, you're just shutting stuff down and you're okay and it doesn't bother you, you're in a good place. So by default, it doesn't just do any process. You have to register processes to kill, but it's a super simple thing to use. I really recommend it for building an application. I think where this really would shine is in development too. If I'm making a new application and I have almost every process set up to just randomly shut down, I could find a lot of issues while I'm working on other stuff and potentially put them in a backlog to fix later. I'm going to start using this on a new project soon. I'm actually going to, a project I want to start doing kind of nights and weekends is making new podcast hosting thing just for me. I'm not super happy with the different things that are out there. They're either not customizable enough or just customizable in a way I don't care about. And I want like real-time stats and stuff. I also want an excuse to use essentially Phoenix with React and Redux and do a real-time architecture thing for it. It's totally unnecessary for podcasting software, but I think it'd be cool for the statistics stuff. There's an app I'm writing for work that kind of has a similar need, so I can learn how to make that app on my off time, writing something for me, and then apply what I learned to the software at work, so I'm not wasting a bunch of time at work doing that because I have plenty of other stuff to do. And the last thing I saw this week that kind of ends up in the, oh crap, I really want to come up with a reason to use this project is Google released their Cloud Vision API. So here's the description. It's really cool. It's Google Cloud Vision API enables developers to understand the content of an image by encapsulating powerful machine learning models in an easy-to-use REST API. It quickly classifies images into thousands of categories, e.g. sailboat, lion, Eiffel Tower, detects individual objects and faces within images, and finds and reads printed words contained within the images. You can build metadata on your image catalog, moderate offensive content, or enable new marketing scenarios through image sentiment analysis. Analyze images uploaded in the request or integrate with your image storage on Google Cloud Storage. During beta, Vision API is not intended for real-time usage on mission-critical applications. So with that last statement, you might want to be careful if you're starting to dig in a new project and want to use it, but I'm sure they're going to come out of beta at some point. So you might be able to start using a little bit now and figure it out. It seems really cool. So all this powerful stuff that, I don't know, seems maybe out of depth for a lot of developers, or not even out of depth. Like, you can do it. All the papers are already out there. You can figure out how to do this stuff. There's a lot of libraries, but having it encapsulated behind just an API interface is awesome. So like a couple things that I'm interested in is, well, just because it's cool, the optical character recognition. So detecting and taking text out of an image and being able to process that separately is really cool. The face detection. So they don't do like, this is John. They won't do that, which is fine, but they'll say, this is a face and this is a face and this is a face. What you can do is sentiment analysis on the person's face. So say for an example, you are a company who's building a UX like analysis piece of software type of thing where user comes to a site and you record their interactions with it. So you could record their face, snapshot images, I don't know, like every 10 seconds or 30 seconds or more if you wanted to, and then send those snapshots of the person's face up to the Cloud Vision API, get the sentiment analysis on whether it's good or bad, and then like somehow bind that to the time in the video. So as somebody doing UX, I wouldn't have to like watch the whole video necessarily. I could kind of zero in on key parts where the person looked mad or the person, you know, looked like they were going to throw their laptop. There's lots of cool things you could do with this. I mean, landmark detection, logo detection. It's so cool. I'm really looking for an excuse to try this. Oh, and the other thing, it's cheap. It's super cheap. So the first 1,000 API calls to the optical character recognition and the image detection attributes, facial recognition, all that stuff, it's free, first 1,000. And then the next 1,000 is, so from 1,000 to 1,000,000 a month is $2.50 per 1,000. So if you're going to do 2,000 of these, you're going to pay $2.50 a month for that service. That's so cheap compared to how much it would cost you to make this thing, or you to try to integrate part of this into your app, even with the libraries. Making it an API is just so easy. I'm looking for any excuse I can find to use this. I can't wait. All right. So now that I got that out of the way, I want to talk about monoliths and microservices. So there were 2 articles that came out this week. I like them both. Some people might think that they have kind of opposing views. I think if you think that, you didn't read them. So one of them is from the prolific DHH, who is the creator of Rails, who's a big proponent of monolithic architecture. But not in all cases. You have to actually read what he says to realize that he is not against the microservices architecture completely. He just thinks for small teams, it doesn't make sense. And I totally agree. The other thing I saw this week was a talk by Ben Christensen, who is an engineer at Facebook, previously at Netflix, wrote Hystrix, smart guy, knows a lot about microservices and service-oriented architecture and distributed systems. But he gave a talk at the Microservices Practitioner Summit called Don't Build a Distributed Monolith. It's a great talk. Agree on so many points about how to avoid falling into some common problems that could lead to overly coupled microservices. So the first one, I think we should talk about the Majestic Monolith article by DHH. Totally agree with them. SOA is not for everyone. It's a great pattern, but if you have 5 developers, probably not for you. If you have 10 developers, it's probably not for you. So where I have a problem mainly with the article is when he thinks you should kick into service-oriented architecture. He's saying you have to have thousands of developers and be a Google or something like that to move to microservices. I don't think that's the case. I think if Google waited till they had thousands of developers to move to microservices or that kind of service-oriented architecture, I think they would have had a ton of problems. And maybe I'm taking them a little too literally, but I just think there's a point where I think you should start thinking about bringing in microservices or some sort of service-oriented design And that's when you start to hit that point where your team is naturally breaking up into teams. So you're decomposing, the application team into the finance team and the client experience team and the authentication systems team. So once you start breaking down into that naturally within an app, it starts to make sense to break things out so that a team can completely and wholly own their application. So they're not stuck using an outdated HTTP library, for instance, to make other web requests. They can pick a newer piece of software that they want to use because it's a separate system. They're not coupled to these legacy decisions. Because, there are a lot of applications with a lot of legacy in it. Every application is a legacy application, essentially. Especially if you're working on something that's been around for years. I'm talking, greater than 3 years, more like 7 or 8 years. If you start talking about an application that you've been writing for 7 or 8 years, let's say a web application, and you have dependencies on a library that hasn't been updated in 4 years because nobody keeps it up anymore. Do I really want to take on that technical debt when I'm starting something brand new that's supposed to be this nice, clean greenfield thing? Or do I just completely rip it out, make it a completely separate thing with its completely own tiny dependency graph because it's small? Personally, I prefer the latter. And that goes to my other point. My other point is, when people start talking about microservices, you're not doing it like all at once. You're not breaking down the entire application and splitting it off into a bunch of different applications on day one. Usually it's like I said, there's an evolution. A team naturally starts to form around a single feature or business aspect. You build a team around that, and then that team can own their thing. And it lives completely in their space, and they have complete control over it. And if everybody's, stuff is all in the same place, the monolithic application, your dependencies are going to start to mess with my dependencies. We're just going to start messing with each other's ideas around how the whole thing should be architected. Typically, you'll find that one team breaks off like that. They do their thing. They have such a good experience because it's completely greenfield. They can do whatever they want. They can pick the language that makes the most sense, the framework that makes the most sense, the libraries that make the most sense. They don't have to follow any testing patterns that you did in the old application. Applications that have been around 7, 8 years have a lot of, like I said, legacy, like weird testing patterns and testing practices that changed over the course of those 7 years. When you break out a service like this, you get to throw all that away and start fresh with modern techniques and not have to adhere to old principles that are probably out of date at this point. And that makes the whole team happier, faster, more productive. They just get things done. So what ends up happening, that one team breaks off, does their thing. Then you start to see other teams essentially get jealous of that and want to break off and do their own thing. And you're going to make mistakes along the way. Microservices is not an easy thing. And it's not a new concept. We've recently been calling it microservices because we want to make tinier things. People like tiny things. Cell phones shrank for the longest time. Now they're getting bigger again. The same thing will probably happen with services. Like if I'm talking about microservices, I'm not necessarily talking about a bunch of applications, hundreds of applications in an ecosystem, all 100 lines of code. I think that gets crazy. So I don't advocate that for a company our size. I'm talking about a little bit of that, if it makes sense, or some bigger applications, maybe 10,000 lines of code or 5,000 lines of code, if it makes sense. Like you have to be pragmatic about it. You just can't say microservices are things that are under 100 lines of code. That's why I would just wish we would call them like external services or something, but it's just not as catchy sounding, I guess. So like company I'm working at, our first microservice that we really brought in was something that I wrote, and it was it's a small HTTP API written in Clojure, and all it does is it wraps Google's phone lib. So Google's phone lib is in Java, and it's a nice way to extract phone numbers from big things of text and just do phone number validation. There was no good implementation of that in Ruby, so I figured I'd just make the application. So I used Clojure because why not? Because it's got great Java inner app, so I wrapped it, used Composure, and just threw it up. It took me a day or two. And now we have all these systems that when they want to do work with phone numbers and validation stuff, they can use the library or they can just use this simple HTTP interface, give it a phone number, and they get back information. And that was less than 100 lines of code. That was such a small library. It's just a wrapper around something else. We saw that worked really well, and we kept going. So now we have more applications that we've brought out, things that just have there's seams in the business concerns that we can take out. Like I said, finance and compliance issues, like they can live in a separate app and they have a different user base. They're not even made for the same people. So there's not really a need to put them all together. They do rely on some information from each other, like when something updated, I need to know about it. But for that, we just send events to RabbitMQ and they get picked up by the various applications that need to know about that. And it's actually really simple. Like we have these clearly defined seams across all the apps, and they could all live within one application. But I think you just end up with a bunch of tangled mess code. Having the microservices, this is my third point, having the microservices keeps you honest about coupling. You have to make sure that really everything is separated away. Otherwise, you're going to have a really hard time in inter-application communication because you're constantly going to be asking things across channels. And that's a smell. Like that's when you have your seams in the wrong spot and you need to rethink your architecture. So that said, if you can't tell, I like microservices for a company the size of ours. And you have to kind of grow into it. You find the problems, you find out how it's going to work for you. So what DHH is saying in this, I get. Like their Basecamp, he says they have 12 developers on this, and it's a biggish application. It's 200 controllers, 900 methods in that. What does he say? This combined with a model of 190 classes with some 1,473 methods. And that's just inside their app directory. It's a Rails app, obviously, if you're familiar. You got 12 programmers working on that. That's not the scale to do microservices. It doesn't make sense. And I really think that's what he's getting at in the article. Like 12 programmers, a microservices team does not make. Where I start thinking about it is when you have multiple teams naturally forming around very specific business features. That's the time to break off. That's the time where making a microservice really makes sense. And I'll just wrap up talking about this one with just saying it's not at 1,000 developers where it makes sense. You don't need 100 people working per microservice. It's just too much. I don't quite get the argument that you need thousands. I think once you start getting to 25, 30, or 50 developers, that range, microservices starts to make sense because that's when you start breaking up your teams. I mean, it really is Conway's Law. You know, if you're not familiar, it's organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. In short, what I think that means is as you break up teams to work on features, your architecture and your system of organization also breaks up in the same way. And I'll really end it this time with I just think microservices and that service-oriented architecture is a natural evolution of an application. And you'll know when you end up there. Don't force it. That's where I think DHH is 100% right. You have to start with the monolith. Don't start with microservices. Starting with microservices, you're just asking to never finish your project. But once you get to that team size, you get to a bigger application size, it really starts to make sense. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was the Don't Build a Distributed Monolith talk by Ben Christensen at the Microservices Practitioner Summit. It's on YouTube. I'll put a link in the show notes, just like everything else that I've talked about. He has a really good warning for anybody building microservices. We all talk about dry principle. It's banged in your head essentially since you started developing. If you started developing on teams, you've heard it forever. But it's don't repeat yourself. And it's all about, don't repeat the same code over and over again. So that doesn't apply to microservices and distributed architectures like this. And that's really what he's getting at with the talk. He starts it by talking about binary dependencies, like dependencies that you have to have for the individual microservice or application to run in the bigger system. A set of libraries that maybe has hundreds of libraries and dependencies in it that are, say, API clients for, to be able to talk to all the services. If you're bringing in these big dependencies and everything has to have it to run, then you lose all the benefits of microservices, but you still have all the problems of fault tolerance and distributed transactions across multiple systems. For me, a big benefit of microservices architecture is the natural polyglot nature. I can use whatever programming language I want to build my service, whatever makes sense. I'm going to choose the programming language that makes it easiest for me and makes the most sense for the problem. That way I can lean into the problem with the right tool. So these binary dependencies, typically it's going to be a library that contains many other libraries. And that library is written in a specific programming language. Say we're talking Rails, like I write this Ruby gem that lives in all the Rails microservice architecture. So by having that, and you have to have this specific gem to make it all work. So now bringing in any other programming language is going to be extremely difficult because all the concepts are wrapped up in this single gem. And if I'm going to bring in Clojure or Haskell, like, guess what? Come here. Haskell don't run Ruby gems. Like, it has its own system. So by not repeating myself, I've essentially I start coupling all these technical decisions, and it makes microservices much more difficult to actually pull off. And like I said, you lose all of the benefits. In this case, polyglotness, if that's a word. So he kind of goes down that thread by talking about how client libraries should not be made by the service team. So the team that makes the service. Because what ends up happening is the client team starts telling all the other teams that, hey, you have to use this library. This is the one way to do it. And they are in charge of it, which is problematic. The service team ends up making what they think people want, which isn't usually the case. I mean, think of any application that you wrote. Like, a lot of the times what you think the client wants isn't really what they want. They want something else. And the service team ends up making a lot of decisions for the client team that really isn't their decision to make. We actually had this happen at work recently where we're essentially building out a bunch of new APIs, and we kind of want to replace our existing infrastructure because it's really ad hoc. And we chose GraphQL as the main query language and mechanism for our APIs. And the reason is because of flexible contracts. You have these client-driven contracts where the client gets to pick how the API is going to function for them in a very simple way. And I really think that's what Ben is getting at in this part of the talk is that, the client team really needs to be driving whatever those contracts and protocols that you're going to be using to talk to the service. Because think about it. This is I don't think he talks about this enough. If I'm a company and I'm talking to some third-party API and I am unhappy with how it works, what am I going to do? Am I going to ask them to change it? Yes, I'm probably going to start there. What if they refuse? What are you going to do? 9 times out of 10, real world, I'll switch vendors. I'm no longer going to use their API. I'm going to actively go find someone else to use. Internally, you can't just switch providers. It's an internal app. There's probably not a lot of competition. You probably don't have 2 teams working on the same thing. I've heard of a few companies that do put teams into competitions like this, but that's a story for another day. You're not going to be able to switch providers for an internal API. You have to do whatever they say. So you're going to get into all these political issues. I'm going to go to my boss and say, hey, this team isn't playing nice with me and they're not doing what I want. And it's just going to lead to all kinds of problems. So it's just best avoided by not letting the service team make these hard rules around this is the library. Ben Christensen talks a lot better about it in this talk than I can right now. So if you want more information, go watch it. He also mentions the book Building Microservices a lot in this talk by Sam Newman. Another big recommendation. I've got a copy. It informs a lot of my thinking around how things should talk. Because coupling is one of the trickier parts of microservices, and you want to make sure you get that bit right. So between Ben's talk and Sam's Building Microservices book, you should be good. And like I said, all in the show notes for you to check out and do your own research, decide if it's for you. Microservices isn't for everybody, but it is for some people. You can't it's not binary. Works great for some, not great for others. You have to decide what's right for your team. All right, well, my office is starting to freeze and I'm getting cold. I don't know what it is, but it's dropped into the 60s in my office because the space heater's been off this whole time. Yeah, so I'm getting cold and I'm going to go. If you like the show, if you got something out of it, do me a favor, go to iTunes, leave a review or a rating or both. It helps other people find the show, lets me know how I'm doing and what I can do better. You can find the link to iTunes on my website, stateofdevelopmentpodcast.com. And again, thanks for listening and have a great week. Thanks.